What if I told you there was once a woman who ruled not as queen, but as emperor, and fed her enemies to living nightmares while the court applauded? Her name was Zetian, a concubine who climbed a staircase of secrets to the dragon throne and turned fear into policy, pain into spectacle, and suspicion into a national language. If you dare to walk the corridor where whispers outlived their owners, hit subscribe now. Because before this tale is done, you'll learn what was hidden beneath the stone floor of her darkest room. The corridor breathes with damp and torch smoke. Lacquered doors glint like watchful eyes. Somewhere beyond the silk screens, a bell chimes the hour and a cage rustles. This is Chang'an at its height, lanterns high poetry, sweet empire wide. And yet the palace heart beats to a colder rhythm. In these chambers, rank is a blade and favor a trap. On nights like this, even the wind seems to bow. Power wears perfume smiles without promise and writes destinies with an unseen hand. She arrived as a minor ornament in a vast household, a name on a roster of beauty expected to age into silence behind monastery walls. But when Emperor Taizong died, she did not vanish. She returned boldly to the orbit of his son, Gaozong. Protocol said no, desire and design said yes. A glance became a conversation, a confidence, a conspiracy with time itself. In a world drilled to say impossible, she learned to pronounce inevitable. There were 2 stars already in Gaozong's sky, Empress Wang, and the favored consort Xiao, shining with titles and allies. Zetian dimmed them without raising her voice. She perfected the art of proximity, a hand on a pulse, a word in an ear, a document that arrived just when doubt was strongest. In a court where truth traveled slower than rumor, she accelerated rumor into verdict. By the time chains clinked, the verdict sounded like common sense. The palace discovered a new vocabulary, inquiries that never ended, interviews that began with compliments and closed with confessions. Records written so neatly that mercy could find no place to sign. Executions had always existed. She reimagined them as messages that walked on their own. Devices multiplied rooms, acquired purposes, and officials learned that a floor can remember footsteps. Pain became a curriculum, survival an exam with questions that changed while you answered. Fear was useful. Systematized fear was law. Across the capital, bronze boxes opened their mouths to swallow anonymous accusations, and a new breed of officer, cruel officials policed the shadows between words. Lai Junction rose like a blade from a sheath, fluent in the grammar of terror. Families dined in whispers. Poems lost their metaphors. Doors were shut softly as if loudness itself were seditious. The city did not sleep, it rehearsed. Where other emperors collected curiosities, she curated consequences. Tigers paced like striped sentences waiting for their periods. Wolves learned to obey more faithfully than courtiers. Even the dogs seemed to understand hierarchy. Processions led the condemned past iron bars so that dread could enter before the body did. The lesson was elegant and terrible. Some verdicts arrive on 4 legs, and the audience is part of the punishment. Paranoia scaled the steps of government. Advisors plotted their own safety instead of policy. Signatures trembled on edicts. Even dreams were interrogated. Zetian did not merely suspect conspiracies, she redesigned the map so that every road could be won. She removed rivals' root and branch, then salted the ground with memory, teaching the court that lineage is not a shield, but a silhouette easily erased when the light is moved. The purges cut through salons and study halls alike. Scholars learned that metaphors can be weapons pointed at their authors. A poem's moon might be read as a hidden face. Old houses with proud genealogies discovered that history has a delete key. And yet the bureaucracy grew sharper. The borders held grain, moved roads were mended. Efficiency became its own alibi, and the empire learned to call silence stability. In the middle of this storm, clerks copied neat columns of outcomes, and somewhere in the archives a careful hand noted what worked, who broke, and how long it took for terror to teach obedience. Ambassadors carried home stories they tried not to believe. Musicians tuned their instruments to drown out certain sounds, and beneath one chamber paved, polished, forgetful workers heard hollow places where the floor did not quite ring true. What had been sealed there and why? If you want more, say okay. The floor of her private chamber was said to rest on hollow spaces, narrow vaults where the air smelled of iron and mildew. Here, officials whispered that bones were stored like ledgers, stacked and hidden, each one belonging to a life consumed by the calculations of empire. And when torchlight flickered through a crack in the stones, guards swore they saw sockets staring back. This is how Zetian ruled, not only with visible terror in the open courts, but with the suggestion that even beneath the souls of the powerful, the restless dead waited, reminding them that a single mistake could pull them below. The palace was not just a seat of government. It became a haunted body whose breath was suspicion. Gaozong, the emperor she had bound to herself, grew weaker in health and will, and as his strength drained away, hers expanded. Ministers realized that audiences with the sovereign meant speaking to Wu, not to him, and soon decrees bore her voice even when his name appeared at the bottom. The irony was that Wu could be effective roads repaired, harvests, organized scholars promoted not by birth but by merit. But these rays of progress always cast longer shadows. Scholars who excelled too brightly risked accusations. Ministers who questioned her methods vanished, and peasants who praised too loudly were suspected of rehearsing rebellion. It was this double-faced builder and destroyer that made her reign so gripping. Imagine the confusion of an envoy who entered to discuss trade and left shaken by a spectacle where prisoners were fed to animals while aristocrats applauded politely, as though cruelty had become part of etiquette. By 690 AD, she no longer hid behind Gaozong's name. She declared herself Emperor, the first and only woman in China to claim the title outright. Temples rewrote prayers to invoke her as divine, and artisans carved her likeness into stone Buddhas that gazed not at eternity but at her. Yet divinity did not soften her. Paranoia sharpened daily. She saw enemies in cousins, conspiracies in poems, rebellion in the eyes of children playing in courtyards. The bronze boxes overflowed with accusations, and scribes carried them like funeral offerings to the cruel officials who already had their tools ready. An official could rise high in the morning and lie broken by evening. Families wrote farewell letters each dawn, some hiding them beneath mats so their children would at least know they had been loved. Ministers learned the art of silence, the discipline of nodding at every word, because dissent had become indistinguishable from suicide. Wu's court became a place where breath itself was political. A cough might be misread as contempt, a smile, as irony, a pause, as hidden criticism. The walls of the audience hall seemed to drink the tension, until courtiers walked as though carrying invisible weights, and silence became louder than speech. And all the while the empress wrote. Her neat hand filled scrolls with notes on torments, on which methods preserved consciousness longest, on which animals caused the deepest panic before the kill. These records were not rumors. Fragments survived chilling in their calmness, like the diary of someone who thought pain itself could be catalogued into order. In the heart of her palace, the menagerie roared. Tigers, wolves, and packs of wild dogs were not trophies, but instruments each assigned to a category of crime. A high traitor went to the tiger, corrupt officials to the wolves, and disloyal family to the dogs. It was theater as much as execution, staged to remind all who watched that loyalty was not owed to heaven, but to Zetian alone. Witnesses described the process as ritualized dread. The condemned were paraded past cages first, forced to inhale the stench of fur blood and rot. The air was thick with growls and snapping jaws, and often the mere sight of what awaited them drew confessions from trembling lips. Confessions sometimes invented just to gain a swifter death. But swiftness was rarely granted. Wu trained her beasts not for efficiency, but for spectacle. Bears were teased into swiping at captives without killing, dragging screams into long crescendos. Tigers learned to pin their prey, licking wounds before tearing deeper. Dogs savored their victims, beginning with feet and hands, leaving the torso for last. Courtiers dined while watching. Silver platters bore duck and wine, while below a human being writhed under claws. Foreign ambassadors fainted or retched at these dinners. Wu only laughed, noting which emissaries showed fear. To her, the disgust of others was another proof of her supremacy. She could command not only armies but the primal stomachs of men. Word of these entertainments spread across borders. Some called her demon, others genius. For the Tang subjects, it was worse. The rumor of the beasts was enough. A whispered threat, "The wolves are waiting," silenced protests faster than decrees ever could. In this way, she governed by imagination as much as by blood. Yet Wu's paranoia sharpened with age. By the 690s, she no longer merely punished rebels. She eradicated entire clans. The root and branch purges meant no cousin, no child, not even household servants were spared. The empire's aristocracy families, proud of centuries of history, vanished overnight like erased brushstrokes. Ministers saw her mourning her own son, forced to suicide by her command, and realized even bloodline was expendable. Another son was exiled and murdered later, and she attended his funeral with eyes dry as parchment. To Wu, heirs were pawns useful until they threatened to become kings in their own right. Scholars, too, felt her fury. Accused of literary treason, poets and historians were executed for metaphors deemed seditious. A moon could be misread as her rivals face a river, as a hidden criticism of her rule. The empire's brightest voices dimmed, and silence draped over the libraries like burial shrouds. The accusation boxes multiplied accusations daily. A neighbor could erase another with a slip of paper. Servants betrayed masters. Children betrayed parents. Husbands betrayed wives. Wu did not need to invent paranoia. She engineered it, turning the empire into an organism that devoured itself, cell by cell, each accusation a bite. But at the peak of this machinery of dread, whispers also began that the empress was not entirely sane. Mercury pills for immortality grayed her skin and thinned her hair. She called herself a living Buddha, demanded worship, and ordered temples to bear her name alongside divine sutras. Even as her body faltered, her delusion swelled to fill the empire. The palace itself transformed into a shrine of her ego. Statues of the Buddha bore her face, towering over courtyards where officials bowed to stone as if to her living form. Prayers were rewritten so that monks invoked Empress Wu, the Enlightened One, and dissent was punishable as blasphemy. To survive was to kneel, to chant her divinity, to let belief replace breath. Yet behind closed doors, a stranger cult grew. Wu surrounded herself with mystics, astrologers, and alchemists, each feeding her visions of eternal rule. Incense thickened the halls, mercury-based elixirs clouded her mind, and ceremonies spiraled into theater of delusion. Ministers watched in silence as the empress held dialogues with invisible spirits, smiling at empty chairs as though occupied. Her obsession with youth took a grotesque turn. In her 70s, Wu filled her chambers with young lovers chosen for their beauty and vigor. But she did not let them age before her eyes. When their vitality began to fade, they were executed, believing perhaps that in their deaths she absorbed the essence of their youth. Their bodies were offerings to her vanity. The empire, meanwhile, trembled on. Armies marched at her command, trade flowed, but the machinery was hollow. Officials wrote final letters each dawn, wives kept funeral clothes folded at bedside, and children grew up knowing that laughter could be fatal if heard by the wrong ear. Stability was an illusion, one that hid the constant sound of grinding teeth and stifled sobs, and yet amid horror she left legacies hard to erase. Wu opened pathways for talent beyond aristocracy. She promoted scholars of humble birth women into posts once barred to them. Roads and canals were restored, borders fortified. Her empire paradoxically functioned even as it suffocated. Terror was the glue that bound progress to pain, but the glue weakened. Her mercury potions ravaged her body. Seizures shook her frame. Visions clouded her judgment. She forgot decrees she had given the day before, launched campaigns only to abandon them, ordered massacres, and then asked why the villages were empty. Ministers began to disobey, praying she would not remember. By 705, her empire was exhausted. Ministers who had survived decades of purges finally acted. They did not face her armies, the terror machine had worn itself out, but found an old woman gray and confused, surrounded by trembling mystics. Wu Zetian, once the nightmare of nations, was quietly stripped of power in her own palace. She died shortly after, likely poisoned by the very elixirs she believed would crown her immortal. Irony sharpened the end. The woman who sought eternal reign was undone by her pursuit of it, her body consumed from within by the poison she called salvation. In death, her legacy split in two. Some remembered the terror, the wolves, the cauldrons, the accusations. Others remembered the reforms, the chance she gave to those born outside noble lines, the efficiency of her administration. Both were true, and together they painted the picture of a ruler both capable and monstrous. Wu Zetian proved what history often tries to deny, that women could wield absolute power as ruthlessly, as brilliantly, and as horrifically as men. Her reign was a paradox, 15 years of brilliance and blood expansion, and extermination, progress, and paranoia. To speak her name was to summon both awe and fear. Yet the terror she spread did not vanish with her death. For years afterward, courtiers walked softly through the palace, lowering their voices, as though Wu Zetian's shadow still lingered in the halls. The cages were empty, the bronze cauldrons cooled, yet imagination kept them alive. Phantom instruments of pain that no one dared forget. Scholars debated whether she was genius or monster saint or fiend. Some praised her for breaking the monopoly of aristocratic families. Others condemned her as a butcher who destroyed culture and trust. The paradox was unsolvable. She was both reformer and executioner, both patron of the arts and exterminator of poets. Folk tales began to rise. Farmers told stories of the demon empress who walked at night, followed by spectral wolves with red eyes. Children were warned not to lie, lest Wu Zetian's bronze box still wait for their confessions. Myth became a second reign, extending her power into memory. Even foreign lands carried her name with unease. Envoys who had once dined in her court repeated tales of aristocrats vomiting at her spectacles of animals trained to torture. In distant courts, her story became a cautionary tale, proof that an empire could prosper outwardly while bleeding inwardly from cruelty. Her tomb, constructed with obsessive grandeur, reflected her contradictions. Carved corridors stretched underground, filled with stone attendants and miniature palaces, as if she planned to rule in death what she had ruled in life. Yet inside, archaeologists later found signs of decay and silence, an emperor entombed not with eternal youth, but with the poison of her own immortality pills. Legends claimed that on some nights the ground near her tomb trembled faintly like the muffled roar of beasts. Locals swore they heard claws scraping stone and believed her menagerie had followed her into the afterlife. Whether invention or superstition, the belief itself testified to how deeply her horrors scarred the collective memory. And still historians point to her undeniable achievements. The Tang Empire under her grew larger, wealthier, and more efficient. She established schools, promoted talent, and left reforms that outlived her. Her cruelty, though unforgettable, was not the only thing she left behind. She was a paradox, builder of bridges and breaker of bloodlines. But for those who lived through her reign, no balance sheet could wash away the fear. A single knock at the door in the night, a rumor in the market, a scrap of paper in a bronze box, each was enough to crush a life. To survive Wu Zetian was not to live fully but to practice silence like a second language. Her reign stands as proof that absolute power knows no gender, no mercy, and no natural limits. Power twisted her into something greater and darker than herself, an embodiment of empire's capacity to devour its children. She was not simply a woman ruling a man's world. She was power ruling humanity stripped of restraint, and perhaps that is the true terror of her story. Not the beasts, not the tortures, not even the purges, but the reminder that cruelty, once enthroned, can wear any face, queen, king, or empress. And when history looks back, it cannot decide whether to shudder at her crimes or marvel at her reign. The final years of Wu Zetian's life unfolded like a slow unmasking. The woman who once commanded beasts and armies now argued with shadows in her chamber, unable to tell if the faces in mirrors were her own or her enemies. The palace walls that once echoed with screams now trembled with her own. Ministers, long paralyzed by fear, discovered a new kind of courage. The courage born not from strength, but from desperation. They watched her tremble with seizures, watched her forget commands, and realized the machine of terror was breaking down from within. For the first time in decades, whispers began to rise against her. The coup that ended her reign was not a dramatic battle, but a quiet removal. Guards who once enforced her nightmares now escorted her gently away, too weak to resist, too poisoned to command. It was a strange end for the most feared ruler in China, dethroned not by revolt of millions, but by the erosion of her own body. When news of her death spread in 705, the empire sighed like lungs, releasing decades of held breath. Families dared to speak louder, poets picked up their brushes, and ministers looked one another in the eye without fear of accusation. Yet the silence of those who had been purged remained a gap that reforms could not fill. The chronicles record her as both ruthless killer and shrewd administrator. In scrolls, she is described as the demon empress and as the sovereign who expanded China's borders. This duality left later generations uneasy, for it forced them to admit that cruelty and competence can walk hand in hand. In folklore, Wu Zetian never truly died. Villagers spoke of her spirit wandering with her pack of wolves seeking new prey. In dreams, she was said to visit those who spoke ill of her, whispering threats into their ears. Even the living avoided her name at night, as though it might summon her back. Scholars, centuries later, sifted through the records she left behind. Some documents detailed executions with surgical precision, which victim lasted longer, which method broke resolve fastest. These writings were clinical, detached, almost scientific, and yet they read like the diary of a woman who believed pain itself could be studied into perfection. What horrified researchers most was not the brutality alone, but the neatness. Margins, aligned ink, steady notes thorough. The cruelty was not chaos, it was order carefully catalogued. Wu Zetian had turned horror into bureaucracy, proving that terror can thrive not in madness but in meticulous calculation. Her story forces a confrontation with the darkest truth of power, that it can reform, while it destroys, build, while it murders, inspire, while it terrifies. Wu Zetian embodied the paradox of empire, its ability to elevate and annihilate in the same breath. And so her reign lingers as a shadow over history, not only as a tale of beasts and blood, but as a mirror held to every age that thinks itself safe from such extremes. She is the question no dynasty, no nation, no people can answer easily. What happens when ambition is boundless, and nothing, not even family or faith, is sacred? The legacy of Zetian is carved not only in stone, but in silence. For centuries, official historians tried to erase her, to downplay her achievements, to brand her only as a monster. Yet the records of roads, canals, and merit-based promotions remain, proving she was more than the nightmare her enemies painted. Still, ordinary people remembered her differently. In villages, elders warned children not to disobey, invoking the empress's name like a curse. In songs, she became a cautionary figure, proof that ambition could grow sharper than any blade, and that mercy could vanish behind the mask of a smile. Even today, her story unsettles. Tourists walk through her tomb at Qianling, peering into the sealed chambers that legend says still contain treasures and terrors. They wonder what might be hidden beneath what scrolls or bones could lie behind walls deliberately left unopened by her successors. Some modern scholars argue she deserves credit as a pioneer for women in power, one who shattered traditions that confined half of humanity to silence. Others insist her crimes outweigh any progress, that her reign is proof not of feminism, but of tyranny unchained. Between these poles, her memory flickers, refusing to settle. What cannot be denied is the atmosphere she created, a kingdom where a cough could condemn, a smile could betray, and even love between parent and child could be poisoned by suspicion. It was a reign that proved terror does not need fire or sword alone. It can live in the very air people breathe. Her life reads like a parable written in blood and ambition. A concubine who strangled her own infant to frame a rival. A sovereign who fed prisoners to beasts while dining on delicacies. A ruler who made even poets fear their own words. Each chapter of her story defies belief, and yet each is written in the ink of history. Perhaps that is why her tale endures, because it asks us to consider how far ambition can go when no law, no tradition, no family bond can stop it. Because it shows that brilliance and brutality can coexist in one human being, leaving behind a legacy impossible to untangle. Zetian was not a demon from folklore nor a goddess from her own delusions. She was something more frightening, a human who proved that power itself can be more destructive than any monster. Her life is a mirror reflecting what happens when restraint is abandoned and cruelty is crowned. And in that mirror, every age must look. Every dynasty, every government, every leader who believes they are immune to corruption must confront the question: if given the same power, would they rule differently? Or would they too feed their enemies to the beasts? So the story of Zetian closes not with peace but with warning. Behind the glory of empire lies the silence of victims, the shadows of paranoia, the roar of animals waiting in their cages. Remember her name, for it is less a